And Brandon House.
I think that so much of what these folks are doing has been put in their heart, in their mind, from a demonic standpoint. I look at many of them, whether Alice Bailey, George Mueller at the United Nations. So many of them have a spiritual aspect to them that goes back to following the father of lies, who wants a world kingdom, who says 5 times in Isaiah 14, I will, I will, I will. And he will get an earthly kingdom. We see that in Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 17, 18. We know ultimately God's kingdom comes. It crushes Satan's kingdom or his Reich. Of God's kingdom, there'll be no end. So I think there is a demonic influence behind all of this, a demonic worldview behind all this. I think that things come up along the way. They then have to figure out how will this be used for their ultimate agenda, or how can they get around it. I do think that they follow certain people in the area of education. I think they follow someone like George Mueller, the father of global education. I think many of them, being occultists, follow the writings of people like Alice Bailey, who was consulting with and talking to a demon, the Tibetan. I think that they follow people like Jean Monnet in his 5-step strategy for a supra authority. And I think through all of these different ideas and philosophies, it is being coordinated at a spiritual level that most people don't take into account. And God is allowing it. I think has let slack on the leash out for Satan to do these things now. Satan, I think, has always wanted a global government. He didn't get it with Mussolini or Hitler. It wasn't God's time. I think it is now God's time. Satan is getting some slack on that leash, and he will be allowed to build this religious empire or Reich of global governance, but God will ultimately destroy it.
Pat, now you seem to think that we're headed into technocracy. You've talked about that a lot here on the program before. What is this going to look like? The question on the table is, what are we being led into? Because even when the president talks about the transformation of America, that's a nice warm fuzzy, but it really has a real meaning to it, doesn't it?
The concept of technocracy is rooted in history back in the 1930s when the movement first started. That's where it got its architecture, if you will. It was only picked up later in the early 1970s, I believe, as a paradigm to shove the world into. I believe this was the original new international economic order that the Trilateral Commission talked about with Brzezinski and Rockefeller in the early days. And the evidence today that technocracy is in play is, I believe, seen all around us through the implementation of Sustainable Development, Agenda 21 with the United Nations, with the so-called green economy that's being promoted by just about everybody in the world today, including the Pope. We see evidences of this, and the word technocracy is used more freely in Europe than it is in America, but it still has a lot of meaning as far as I'm concerned. The bottom line to technocracy is scientific dictatorship. That's exactly where it's headed. And the only 2 authors in history that have written succinctly about technocracy include Orwell and Aldous Huxley with Brave New World. Both of them were looking at technocracy when they penned their science fiction books, and they saw the inevitable conclusion of technocracy, I believe. Whether they agreed with it or not is another issue. But this is where it's headed today, and the manacle is being placed around the necks of humankind. It's getting tighter and tighter, more electrified, if you will, as time goes on. The constraints are coming in from all sides on us, where our movement is being curtailed, our choices are being curtailed, and our life is being narrowed down, if you will. So I think it's headed towards scientific dictatorship, personally.
Okay, so Brandon, now Pat thinks that it's going to be an electronic dictatorship. I tend to think it's going to look a lot more like what I call an oligarchic dictatorship, meaning big business, big government in bed together. And the technocracy part, as I see it, Pat, is that the government will know everything that we're thinking and reading and doing and saying and dictating to us with all these feedback loops to make sure we're complying. That's what I see in the whole part of technocracy on this part. Now, Brandon, how do you see that?
You know, I think technocracy, if you mean by that sustainable development and these kind of things, yes, I think that'll be a part of it. In my book, The Coming Religious Reich, out this fall, I believe there are basically 4 E's that are building this religious Reich or religious empire or kingdom that I think will be a European-centric world government. It's education, environmentalism, economics, and ecumenicalism. I think those 4 E's are what will build it. And I've said this is the 3rd book in a trilogy, the first one being Grave Influence, 21 Radicals and Their Worldviews Ruling America from the Grave, the second one being Religious Trojan Horse, and the third being the religious right. And in those previous two books, I explained that you're going to have politicians speaking more spiritually, and you're going to have spiritual leaders speaking more politically. And that's what we see, whether it's Rick Warren becoming more political or whether it's the Pope becoming more political. And then you have people like Tony Blair, political, becoming more spiritual. And so I think we see, again, the 4 E's is what's driving this. And I think technocracy is a part of that.
And if you read the Pope's latest encyclical, Laudato Si, what is interesting is that a large part of the verbiage seems to come right out of the Sustainable Development Playbook at the United Nations. So it's clear he didn't think this up. He's got some advisors advising him because the verbiage, the language, the allegations about the environment and everything else are all the same.
The connection between the United Nations and the Vatican goes all the way back to when, I think, 64, the Pope left his tiara, a symbol of papacy power at the United Nations. A lot of this goes back to Robert Mueller at the United Nations, who rises to being Assistant Secretary General of the UN, started 11 different agencies there, was there for 40 years, the father of global education, of which No Child Left Behind, America 2000, Goals 2000, Race to the Top are all Common Core, all based on, who was influenced by Alice Bailey, who was fooling around with a demon, who was influenced by Teilhard de Chardin, a Jesuit priest. The connection between the Vatican, I think it was one of the guys at the UN said years ago, there are two popes on the planet, a pope in New York, the UN Secretary General, and a pope at the Vatican. So the connection between the Pope and the UN, the Vatican and the UN is generational. And so to have the Pope coming out in his 40,000 word encyclical in June of 2015, pushing sustainable development fits exactly with what Pope Benedict did, which, by the way, Pope Francis quotes Pope Benedict in his recent encyclical, calling for a world political authority with teeth. And in fact, Pope Benedict said the United Nations should be the lead organization. It's already here, so why not let it take the lead? I think you've got these two groups working together in concert because they have a shared worldview.
Yeah, and the question is, whenever you're talking about transformation, what are we transforming into? And that's where it always gets blurry, which, of course, sets up the red flags for me.
Yes, and I think what we're transferring into is a religious ecumenical system, a religious ecological system, a religious and ecological financial system. I think all of those go together.
All right, let's take a breath and a timeout for a station break right now. Brandon House does his own daily radio program. Most of his materials are found at worldviewtimes.com. He has videos and other materials available. We're doing a roundtable conversation today on what are the globalists up to. There has been a move to establish a global government for over a century. Various groups have been involved in promoting that. Also joining me is Dr. Dennis Cuddy and Pat Wood. We'll be back. We're at steelonsteel.com. Remember to like us on Facebook. I'm John Leffler, and the program is Steel on Steel. You know, it's interesting that in a time when we're being told that religion shouldn't be involved in politics at the global level, religion and politics is once again mixing, and it's a varied form of religion, from some traditionalist religions to what we would call pantheism or panentheism. There are a number of different names for that. Welcome back to Steel on Steel. John Leffler here with you. Here we are, end of summer, and we're doing our analysis of what's going on with globalism with three panelists. We like to have panel discussions here from time to time. Dr. Dennis Cuddy joining us from North Carolina, Pat Wood from Arizona, and from Tennessee, Brandon House. And Brandon, you were talking just as we went into the station break. I want to look at the religious dimension that is playing into what we're seeing in the emergence of this new, the best thing you can call it is a new order. And we know that some of the economic elites are talking about a new economic order. The Pope's advisor, Schellenhuber, in the environmental area is talking about the new global order that's needed. Everybody's talking about a new global order. The real trick is trying to find out what it's going to look like as it arrives.
If you go to the idea of man is divine, pantheism, all is God, panentheism, God is in all the world's religions, false religions can unite around that. They can all unite around the idea of an ecological and human social justice. So they can unite because of pantheism around Mother Earth, Gaia worship. I mean, if all is God, that means man is God. If God is in all, that means God is in creation. So a pantheistic, panentheistic worldview, man is divine, the earth is divine, we're all one, then lends itself to a world religion that then is propped up by an economic system that supports that through an ecological social justice, whether it's carbon credits or other things that bring an emphasis onto Mother Earth and our footprint. but it also brings it onto a social justice dealing with humans and redistribution of wealth, which the Pope talked about in his encyclical. So I think it's all intertwined.
There's a lot of evidence that this whole movement is intensely spiritual. And it's spiritual from maybe perhaps a number of different angles. All of the world's major religions have been running headlong into sustainable development, climate change policies, and so on. In fact, the Interfaith Summit on Climate Change in 2014 prompted the World Council of Churches to release a press release after the fact that said it will be a time that people remember as the time when the world's faiths declared themselves irrevocably as green faiths. And this was before the Pope jumped into it with both feet. But then there's another aspect. Of course, this was an interfaith summit. There was non-Christian religions represented as well. But there's another aspect to it, and that is that both technocracy and transhumanism, the two Siamese twins as I look at them, they're both based on the philosophy of scientism. And scientism very much is a religious proposition. And you can't really follow these things. You can't really get into them except that you buy into this religious proposition that reality can only be discovered through science and through the scientific method. And of course, biblically speaking, this is nonsense. The Bible declares what truth is, and it's not just simply limited to the scientific method as these people believe. Yet, they would set science up as a god unto which the priest would go and listen very carefully with intent to see what the God of science would say today so that they can take the message back down the mountain to the peons.
Well, what Brandon said about the 4 E's is absolutely correct. When I did that book back in 1991 called Now is the Dawning of the New Age, New World Order, at the time I only had 3 E's at the front. It was economics, ecumenism, and ecology, but now Brandon's correctly added a fourth dimension to this. And historically, because I try to look back as well as forward, this was, again, not by chance, but it was a strategy that was used by people talking about Catholics. The Illuminati was a renegade Jesuit called Adam Weishaupt. And I'm not going to go through the whole history of the Illuminati, but the point being they wanted to destroy not only monarchical authority, kings and queens and so on, but religious authority as well. And so it was picked up by the Owenites when they came over here in New Harmony, Indiana, and formed the first commune. They linked up with Madame Francoise de Rougemont, called Fanny Wright, who had been brought over by the Marquis de Lafayette, because the Illuminati had infiltrated the Masonic lodges and created the French Revolution. And so they didn't want to just directly in this country, because we had strong biblical basis in schools and churches. So they were going to do it indirectly. And what they did was they formed the first commune about 1828, and then next year, 1829, they formed the Working Men's Party. This is way before Karl Marx. And then later on, Orestes Brownson, who they hooked up with in New York, had second thoughts, and he spilled the beans and said, here's what we were up to. We were not only going to have a political dimension and control labor unions, but we were going to use schools. We were going to create public schools that we call national schools, and we're going to get God out of them and substitute science, which is what Pat's been talking about. And that's why Robert Dale Owen, when he ran for Congress from Indiana, created the Smithsonian, because that was to be their new temple of science, and then progressed from there. And then Karl Marx got hooked up into the whole thing and so forth and so on. And so when you got to the turn of the century, you already had this religion of humanity, as Auguste Comte came to call it, and various positivists, the young Felix Frankfurter and Oliver Wendell Holmes got into the judicial system. But what happened is at the turn of the century, going from 1800s into the 1900s, there was a famous author named Jack London, and he said that the model, you were saying, John, the oligarchs and the plutocrats, Jack London said the model that they would use in oligarchy, when you link up business and government, becomes fascism, which Mussolini later would bring about, was going to be W.J. Gint's book, Our Benevolent Feudalism. And I picked up on that in my third book ago when I call it New World Order Techno-Feudalism, because you're combining, like Pat said, with technocracy and a sort of feudalistic element. Then the middle class is being hammered. You'll have the lower class. You'll have the elite at the top, which follows Plato's plan of the Republic and the philosopher kings and all that sort of stuff, into this sort of techno-feudal future. And you can see it coming along through science. You had the Fabian socialist Bertrand Russell in the early 50s writing the impact of science on society. And he wrote in there how they would use science to create control mechanisms over the people. You would have Brzezinski shortly thereafter talking to some extent about